Smith, did you have some questions for Mr. Amic?
I do not.
You do not? Okay.
My next one is
Dana Smith, okay. We'll let Mr. Amic go ahead.
Am I free to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Tell us who you are, where you live, and then try to get to the point. Be
Succinct.
brief. We have, that's
I
right.
understand.
We have a lot of people that want to talk.
Yep, I understand and appreciate that. My name is Mark Amic. I live here in Milton, Georgia, and I'm a statewide poll watcher for this past election. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to speak here today and speak about these important matters and observations that I saw in my role, fraud and other irregularities in the process. You know, there's a few different things, and I'll get through these relatively quickly, as again, to be succinct. There was one instance on Election Day where I was denied entry into a polling location at Birmingham Falls Elementary in Milton, Georgia. I was wearing my badge and presented my Secretary of State letter to the poll manager. She denied me entry. I pointed to the information on the letter that designated that I was allowed to be there. She disagreed, would not let me in, and was turned away. I was also went to two other locations in Roswell on election morning. Both instances which I was informed that Democrat poll watchers were engaging with voters outside of the elementary schools. This was at Mimosa Elementary, and both of these turned out to be valid as well. This was at Mimosa Elementary, where they were standing between the parking lot and the entryway to the school, engaging with voters to and from. And then also at Esther Jackson Elementary School, where the two Democrat poll watchers there had been engaging with voters outside of the school while they were in line, apparently collecting voter data on their phones. Moving ahead to the recount, the first one that is, in DeKalb County on Sunday, November 15th, I arrived at that facility. The observation process was very difficult. The tables were set up in groups of 16, yet we were only allowed one person for every 10 tables, so that was difficult to manage through. We were required to be 6 feet away from the tables and as well as the personnel, despite our being issued a required mask by DeKalb County. After growing frustrated with trying to watch this process, I tried to find somewhere where I could go add some more value. So I decided to stand behind a table where the two workers were actually entering in the signed vote totals into the Arlo system for the final count. I was standing about 6 feet or so behind the workers. While I could not see the computer screen to validate what they were entering into the system, I was able to read the sheets that the person was providing to them. So I decided I would start taking notes on that in case there was an opportunity to provide an audit or something that was necessary to cross-reference what was actually submitted and what was actually input into the system. After a while, I was able to see a pattern of what I would expect in terms of the vote totals. I'd ballpark that around 1,500. And one came through that was a serious red flag. And that one came through at 10,707 votes for Biden and 13 for President Trump. And so I turned to the person that was next to me and said it to her, but loud enough so the workers in front of me could hear that. And that was that 10,000 votes for Biden, that can't be right. And wanted to make sure that they heard that so that it would get flagged. They then whispered amongst themselves for some time, trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, a manager was called over, and I followed that paper and that manager through the process. She went towards the back of the room where they take the ballots in and out and spoke with two other workers. I stayed some distance back because of requirements, but yet I could make out the fact that they were trying to ascertain what that vote total was as well and why it was that way. They also discussed about whether or not to make that change on their own based upon what they thought that the two counters had meant for that total to be. Although they did, I think they decided not to do that because one, they looked over at me, made some eye contact, and the conversation changed to a whisper. But at the same time, they were also talking about they could not determine how that error had occurred or fraud because the numbers didn't match up. It wasn't a decimal. It wasn't a digit issue. It was so significantly wrong. Later through that process, I decided to engage Mr. Tillman, who was who I understood to be the election director for DeKalb County there, and informed him of the issue, let him know the serious concern that I had, and that we discussed recounting that box. He went and verified that with his team, and he came back and agreed that that 10,000 count couldn't possibly be right. And we worked out an arrangement to where I would follow that box through the rest of the process, through the recounting process, to ensure that it was counted correctly. And he had a new team come in about 45 minutes later. I watched and observed that process. I think the new team that came in did an excellent job. And that final vote total for Biden ended up being 1,081 and not 10,707 as initially submitted and signed off on by the two counters to be going into the system. So 9,626 vote difference, pretty significant. I also did flag the fact that, I don't know if they have gone back to look at what those other two counters have done with other ballot boxes to validate that authenticity as well, and certainly don't know if anything was skimmed off the tops of the others, a few votes here and there, give or for any given candidate. But the egregious error was what I was able to catch. Going back to November 6th, these two incidents occur at State Farm Arena, where on the day that they were that they were processing the provisional ballots, the military and UOCAVA ballots on that day. Two things with this. One was after observing the process, I flagged it the next day in email and then signed an affidavit to the fact that I thought that the process lent itself and was open to significant fraud opportunities at 2 points. So what they do, is my understanding, as it was explained to us by Rick Barron, that what they will do with the military and overseas the UOCAVA is they will email a form to that voter. That voter then prints the form, marks the form with their vote choices, and then mails back that hard copy. Fulton County, they receive it, they go through a process of what's called duplication. And what that process was, as it was explained to us, is that a worker who we were not allowed to engage with or witness to verify its authenticity will then take that form and then is supposed to duplicate that voter's choice onto the ballot. This is all, in a situation where you're not able to observe it from a distance roughly this far apart or greater. Actually, it is greater than this. So no possible way to see it, and no verification or authenticity of the process that I could see and that we were told or informed about. Another serious concern with that process happens later when the ballots are then provided to another individual who actually goes and casts the ballots. So you are not allowed to see what ballot choices are cast on behalf of that voter that's in our military or overseas. And that, in my opinion, was an opportunity because there's no validation or observation or ability to observe whether that was done correctly as well. And then after I flagged that early on, like I said, the next day and filed an affidavit to my concerns over that process, and obviously have since learned that vote total ended up being roughly 900 to nothing in favor of Joe Biden versus President Trump. So pretty alarming and concerning. On that same day, I noticed this is in regards to the Secretary of State's representative that was on site that day. And what this is basically entailing, I believe I've provided this information previously, and that is that the vote count was supposed to start at 8:30. It didn't start until roughly 8:50 that morning. I first noticed the Secretary of State representative that entered the room around mid-morning, and didn't make too much of that at the time, but something told me, because I went back and looked at my notes and what I did from a picture standpoint, that something was not quite right, because at 11:45, I was documenting already that he was outside the room, leaning against the wall on his phone, texting or what have you. Now, that in itself wouldn't be that particularly big deal, but something had struck me that I needed to start documenting that. As it goes through the day, approximately 1:35, I realized that it was the first time that I had seen this representative who was potentially providing oversight actually out on the floor with the workers. And the first time I had seen that was at 1:35. And I want to clarify that I got there at 8:20. I was probably one of the first couple people there in the room. I took the first table in the front row, and that's predominantly where I stayed most of the day. I noticed that as I looked around and wondered where he was at the rest of the time, I noticed that he was actually back in the corner on his phone. And so what I decided to do from that point on, and I should ask, and I don't know if it's proper to ask, so I apologize if it's not proper protocol, but I've submitted pictures if they've been made available. If not, I do have those on a jump drive that I have brought with me. I probably should have brought that up first.
I'm sorry, just tell us what you saw, and we'll open it up for a few questions.
Sure,
in another
so fair
minute.
enough.
So
What I decided to then do was further document that this person was not providing oversight, just in case there was a claim later that there was, because my concerns over how the ballots were being processed. And so I started taking selfies over my shoulder, so I've got this so I can validate that it's me, it's over my shoulder, and he's further back in the corner, just, kind of semi-slumped on his phone in different positions. And I started taking pictures at 2:37, 3:51, 4:47, 5:41, and so on forth, that he was back there in the corner at the back of the room, not providing oversight or engagement or anything on the floor there. I did leave for dinner for a bit, and when I came back, I had walked down the hall briefly. He was at the end of the hall on a phone call. I walked out. He was a few steps behind me, and he was complaining about parking. He was concerned about, I'm not sure if I parked in the Ruby lot or if it's the red lot, and if I don't know how this is going to work, and if it's the red lot or the Ruby lot, and the cost because he was going to be there for over 10 hours and how expensive that was going to be. So, and then through the rest of the evening, he was predominantly at the back of the room, and I provided specific time points of when he entered and what have you for the record.
Okay, all right. Any questions for Mr. Amic? Senator Dolezal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Was it Mr. Amic? I don't want to mispronounce your name.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. You've been doing this for a number of years, from what I gather from your testimony. Is that correct? The poll observing?
Actually, this is my third presidential.
Great.
Yes.
How does your access this year relative to distances compare to your access in previous years?
So that's an interesting question. So I moved here roughly 3.5 years ago from Texas. So my reference point is a little bit different, from that perspective. But I will say that the ability to access and witness the process was significantly limited in every part of the process, whether it was just going to a polling location or certainly State Farm Arena and certainly DeKalb County.
You mentioned the Secretary of State's poll watcher, which, as I understand, is the result of a settlement from when the state sued Fulton County some years ago, that we now have a Secretary of State paid poll watcher in the room. Was this gentleman that you observed the only Secretary of State poll watcher? How did you identify him as being such? Did you see anybody else that was working under the direction of the Secretary's office?
I did not. So the gentleman, when he came in, there was another watcher with us who said that was the individual, and he had on the little gold Secretary of State emblem lapel pin. And he certainly was, he was out on the floor and engaged with the manners whenever he chose, which was limited, but that was how I was able to ascertain that.
So he had access to the floor, obviously, that you were not, being that he was a state employee.
Correct.
And were you there? This was during the recount process? The risk limiting audit recount process?
So that particular day was November 6th, which was still the processing of the initial count.
Okay.
So it was provisional, military, and Uwakava.
Okay. So just to clarify, in that room, and I believe it's the room we saw the video from earlier then, is that accurate?
I did not see I was not here at the time to see the video, so I can't
How
reference
large
that.
was the room approximately?
It's too large to observe, and the layout of the room is kind of dog-legged, so you can't, the way they have you pushed back against one part of the area, which is the short part of the room, it extends way past, and you actually can't see. There's actually a door where they bring, at least that's my understanding, because you can't see it. But
That
it's
sounds
where
like the
they-
room that we saw the video of
Yeah,
earlier. And just to clarify, so in your day there, you saw one member of the Secretary of State's staff, and you would, I guess, as a blanket statement, describe him as mildly engaged in oversight process and more engaged in doing something on his phone in a corner of the room.
I don't even think that I wouldn't go as far as saying mildly engaged.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Tillery,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
you're on. Get it close.
I want to go back into your testimony and ask you, when you said you identified that ballot box that was way skewed, not the 900 to 0 one, but the one before that, what was the process of the recount, or what happened to make those numbers change? Did somebody pull the paper out and count it? Was it a card that someone reran? Can you help me understand that?
Sure, so I just want to make sure we're talking about, just to clarify, so the DeKalb
Yeah, the DeKalb
recount?
box.
Okay, yeah.
Can you remind me of the numbers just so I can make sure that's the one I was talking
Sure.
about?
So what was signed off and submitted to be entered into that Arlo system as final was 10,707 votes for Biden and 13 for Trump.
And this would have been signed off on just like a sheet, or this would have been a box and they would have put a number on top of it and said this is 10,000 to 1,000? Or?
Yeah, sure. So what they do is after they do a count, there's I'm approximating the form, but they basically would say the batch, which is the box. So it had an identification number associated with that. There was a color table, and then the number that was associated with it. And then it would have the count for the candidates on those sheets with different line items. And at the bottom, 2 spaces for signatures to supposedly authenticate and validate that the count is correct.
So to re-verify that, or when you noted it, and thank you for noting it, did they actually open a box and go back through and recount it, or do you know?
So-
how that,
so I didn't
I'm
see
trying
what-
to figure out if it was data or if it was paper. That's kind of what I'm trying to get to.
Sure. So I did not see the counting of that box initially. So what I was doing is I was standing back because the counting was just, it wasn't adding a lot of value, I didn't think. And so I was trying to find something that would make a difference. And so I stood behind the table where they take those sheets and they'll say, okay, batch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, X amount for Biden, X amount for President Trump, and the person enters that in the computer, okay? So I was standing back there. I was able, because I was taking notes of those items as we went through, I was able to gain an expectation of what the total should be or a pattern with therein. And that one came through as so egregious and so large that that's how I was able to get flagged, frankly.
If you had not flagged it, is it something, and I'm asking you to kind of going down the road, you may not know this about our election procedure, and I apologize for asking you a question you may not know the
That's
answer
fine.
to.
Yep.
If you had not flagged it and we had gone through this recanvassing process, is this something that would have been caught then, or do you think it would have gone through that entire process and not been caught too?
So that's part of a process I couldn't speak to, so I certainly would hate to
That's very fair. I
speculate
just-
beyond that.
I didn't
I
know.
will say that I was concerned about it being entered in based upon what they said later, because as the sheets were brought back to verify, okay, here's the original, after we went through the recount process, again, I tracked those sheets because I was not going to let that out of my sight.
Right.
And they were brought over to the table, and we verified side by side. I also had a couple other people look, so it wasn't just me, so that people could see the initial sheets and the totals and that they were signed off on. But the lady the workers had changed out, one of them had changed out, and the one that was there said that she could feel, the phrase was, she knew it was wrong, but she could feel the eyes upon her. And so that is an interesting phrase and leads credence to why we have poll watchers, frankly.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate your time today. Thank you. And we're going to need to move on to the next witness, so
Sure.
we appreciate you being
Thank
here.
you.
All right. The next we'll call Dana Smith. Is that correct?